To start, we have Sriram and Shahar, who you guys may remember from our Evolution of Blockchain Technologies panel this morning. And now they're going to be doing a deep dive into how Web3 has progressed and grown over the past years, where it is now, and where we think it's headed. This discussion will be moderated by Pruitt Martin, who is a student at Georgia Tech, co-founder of Blockchain at Georgia Tech and Web3 ATL, and 404 DAO. Please join me in welcoming them to the stage.
Good afternoon. Cool. Awesome. So Sriram, Shahar, thank you so much for joining me up here on stage. Very excited to talk about the pillars of Web3. And I know at the beginning of the conference, for those that were here, I was like, who has a definition of Web3? And no one raised their hand. So I'm going to put both of you on the spot, actually, and ask for a 1 to 2 sentence definition of what Web3 is, just to kick off the panel here.
All right. I'll go for it. Web3 is the internet of value. Okay, and so what does that mean? So Web 2, apps that we use today, right? We call it the Internet of Information. What that means is that Web 2 made it so that exchange of information became permissionless and very, very seamless, right? So in Web 2, right, if you had someone's phone number or you had someone's email address, you now could send them information, of all sorts of types of information, and you could do so permissionlessly, right? And all you needed really was an internet connection, right? Wherever you are in the world, if I have your phone number and an internet connection, I can send you information. Web3 is doing that for value, right? So similar to like a phone number or an email address, if I have your wallet address on Bitcoin or on Ethereum or on another blockchain, if I have your wallet address, I can send you value permissionlessly with only an internet connection, okay? So that's the essential thing, right, that we have here with this. It's very powerful, right? We've just as Web 2 disrupted every industry that mediated information, right? Because now the mediation of information became permissionless and highly open and accessible. I believe, and I think we're seeing, Web 3 disrupt every industry that mediates in value, right? And so that's quite a lot of things.
Shahar covered it extremely well. There'll be some, let's call it terminology that we'll talk more about as we go along, but it's the transfer value in a decentralized, trustless environment in a manner that's incentive aligned. And we'll hopefully get an opportunity to talk about each one of these. But in one sentence, it would exactly be that. It's how do you transfer value in a trustless, decentralized, incentive-aligned way?
Yeah, I think that was put pretty eloquently at Sriram, of just transferring value, and you touched on a couple buzzwords that we've been talking about all this morning, words that you've probably seen if you've been reading about Web3 or crypto. So I do want to kind of break those down for those that are maybe new to the space. I know we've been discussing them throughout the morning, but specifically maybe like starting with the incentive aligned, like what exactly does that look like in Web3? How is it facilitated? Like what exactly is that alignment of incentives?
Yeah, well, it can be anything. I think the point is that we can have very specific, very intentional, in fact, programmatic incentive alignment within these Web3 systems. And that's because, right, we have this value layer, right, that I described as Web3 to transact value permissionlessly and trustlessly. So we can program on top of that incentives that we know will execute in a certain way, right? So when the federal government announces some kind of incentive, I don't know, like PPP loans, was that what it was? Or like the small business, like post-COVID loans, nobody really knew how these incentives were getting executed. And then it came to light that, in fact, these incentives had been executed pretty poorly, right? And you had these massive businesses getting, you know, hundreds of millions in loans that they didn't really need. On Web3, you know, we could do that programmatically, right? Where we could write some rules. If you have such and such, you know, in your wallet, or if you've done such and such activity on the blockchain, you know, on chain, we can all see, we can incentivize that behavior directly. And we send these incentives directly to your wallet, and we can all verify that yes, you did in fact receive those incentives into your wallet at such and such a timestamp because it's on the blockchain, right? It's immutable, it lives immutably on Ethereum, for instance. So Web3 gives us the ability to do these types of intentional and transparent incentive alignments, right? It does not inherently have incentive alignment, of course, right? We still have to build and decide what these incentives are, how they get executed, how they get distributed. But at least, we can make those decisions and we can know, how they're being executed without having to trust any single party.
Perfect. I think that that covers it very well. I think in terms of incentive alignment, if I may take it one step further, a functional ecosystem of anything, whether it be a state, a country, a small piece of, HOA, works only when there's some degree of alignment of incentives. If there's not any alignment of incentives, that's anarchy. And so to be able to align incentives is fundamental to operating any system, whether it be a small local system, the whole global enterprise, anything in between. And understanding, as Shahar said, how do you align incentives in a decentralized, trustless, permissionless way is a big, big deal. Because if you can really do that and do that the right way and architect it the right way, you can build a system that will work at a global scale. Remember, all of this is global scale. This is not something we're trying to do in one little environment. We're trying to change and bring about this type of change, just like the internet did, to everything. Can we do that is not just an interesting question, but it is unlocking the potential of Web3. If you do that right, you can bring about change in multiple domains, whether they be professional domains or other domains, and make Web3 truly what it's meant to be.
Yeah, and if I could expand, I think that's really great. Imagine a world, right, where we knew, the incentive alignment of a certain system. Like how many of you know all of the incentives in play in the banking sector? How many of you know all the incentives in play in politics, right? And I think, that this is a big problem, right? It leads to a lot of problems. And it leads to us not even being able to agree, on the facts a lot of the time. So, I just like to imagine a world, right, where, we may not always agree on what the incentives should be and how they should be allocated, but we at least know what's happening. We know where they're going. We know how they're being executed. Anyone that wants to take the time to go on chain and verify these things can, right? And then they can be part of that conversation. And so it just elevates the debate that we can have, right, on how we want to design these systems, right, whether it's banking or governance or any number of things.
Yeah, I think the transparency is a huge value add just from Web 2 to Web 3, of being able to see everything that's going on, see the incentives in play here. Another aspect that I think is very important as well is the ownership, using tokens to maybe facilitate those incentives. We've seen over the last 2 years or so, a lot of projects issue their own tokens in order to incentivize users to use a product, incentivize users to act in a certain way. So I'm curious if you guys can touch on a little bit of the ownership side. How important do you see ownership being a part of Web3? And maybe if you can give some examples that you've seen of these incentives in play in real life.
You want to start with that one?
Yeah, sure. So the incentive-aligned strategies, and by the way, incentive alignment is important Web3 or not, just to make sure. Incentive alignment in life is important, as an individual is important, job satisfaction is important. So incentive alignment as a concept is critical, but Web3, with decentralized, trustless, permissionless systems, incentive alignment is critical, because if you don't align the incentives right, you can have ecosystems that implode. There are very well done incentive aligned systems, and there are also not very well done systems that have since not performed very well. I will not give examples, and again, I don't want to do this by example, but I want to do it by use case, right? So a couple of good use cases where you align incentives are systems where you bring in and create a new financial tool. This could be what's called a decentralized exchange, we'll talk about later in the DeFi set. It could be applications, metaverse applications, where you are incentivized to engage with a particular game, a particular interface. The entire notion here, or it could be an infrastructure project. It could be somewhere where you're deploying compute, storage, 5G, where you're incentivized to do so. And the incentives are designed in such a way where you do this application, do this deployment, this infrastructure, this game, this interaction, this financial tool, in such a way that it compensates each individual, you, to do that activity in such a way that benefits you personally and benefits the whole ecosystem in the process. You are a rational player in a game. And I'm sorry, I don't mean to, each one of you has your own individual way of thinking, your own individual way of interacting with the world. But I'm going to say that you're rational, and I'm going to say you're playing this in benefit to you, and in benefiting you, if I can benefit the whole ecosystem and I can benefit all of society, and I can create something called a stable equilibrium, hopefully, then I have created a decent incentive system. And that is the goal here. How do I do that? And as I said, it has been very well done across many segments. Unfortunately, over the past decade, we have seen where it's been poorly done too, in such a way that people have incentives to what's called RUG, a system. Now, those examples serve as good learning. We're still in the early days. In good learning to go back, think through what was done wrong, and then build good incentive-aligned systems that do not have those issues.
Cool, yeah. So I want to talk a bit about ownership, I guess. And let's think about ownership, okay? Let's think about the history of ownership. Does anyone know when ownership was first codified? It's unfair pop quiz because I know this, but it's about 5,000 years ago. It was about 5,000 years ago with the Code of Hammurabi, okay, in ancient Babylon. So my organization, my meetup group that I started, I called it Babylon. Everyone's like, why they call it Babylon? It's because Babylon, ancient Mesopotamia, was the birthplace of property rights and ownership. The Code of Hammurabi, which was this stela that they wrote on, and we found it obviously thousands of years later, actually codified all of these rules for how ownership works, right? And a lot of these we still use today, right? I mean, ownership as a concept, right, hasn't changed that much. But basically what people figured out in ancient Mesopotamia is you could write things on like clay tablets, right? And then you could bake the clay tablet and it would harden and it would have some permanence, right? And so they used this to record all sorts of ownership. And that gave rise to commerce. It gave rise to lending. It gave rise to business. And society flourished in that time. So having ownership rights is very, very important, right? For a lot of those reasons, so you can have free and open commerce with least amount of friction. But it's hard to scale ownership rights. And what people had to do if they wanted to really scale ownership rights is they had to set up central intermediaries that would assert, or back up, your ownership claim, and this became governments, right? A central function of governments, and we had no other way to do this, right? This was a good idea, right? We want, ownership rights to be respected if I stay in ancient Mesopotamia or if I take the long, trail into Europe or something like that, right? Now, of course, that didn't work so well, right? Because we only had governments in the context of your local government that would enforce, property rights, so it's hard to scale that. Now, today, right, our attempt to scale that, we haven't changed that much. We still rely on centralized governments to assert, to honor right, and enforce property rights, all of our property rights. And so you register your, your land with the government, you register your car title with the DMV, and you have to do all of these things, right, so that your property rights are respected. Now, we have it pretty good in this country, right? We don't have to really worry about someone, the government changing their mind and being like, oh, you don't own this anymore, because we're the arbiter of truth when it comes to property rights. And so what we said, but here, we don't really have to worry about that. But not so in other countries, right? And there are many, many examples of this, of course, where governments have decided, usually, to a certain group, like, you know what, we don't like you guys anymore. So that stuff that you thought you owned, you don't own it, right? And sorry about that, right? Now, and this was a problem that we couldn't really solve, right? Until now, right? Because now we can use these wonderful blockchains and distributed ledgers that are enforced programmatically by a set of computers all around the world that anyone can run or participate in, making it very hard to shut down, that will enforce these property rights. And, well, I guess enforce is sort of a strong word, because at the end of the day, they don't necessarily enforce it in the real world, but they create the record, right? So if you change your mind, right, and you say, well, you don't own this, it's like, well, yes, I do. It's on the ledger. I didn't transfer it. It's right there. Now, whether or not we decide to enforce that, right, is actually a really, really important question that's being fought over, right? We need to make these types of property rights hold up in court, right? And the government has to kind of take this step. That's up to all of us, right, to get done. It's very important. But the point I want to make, right, is that we have this new tool to assert and potentially enforce, right, back up claims to property rights, which is truly global, truly decentralized, right? And that's a really big idea, for thousands of years, right? We have not had anything like this. And we can finally, fundamentally change the way we think about and use our property rights. So I think, yeah, it's a pretty, and I do see that as a pillar of Web3, this idea of ownership.
Yeah, no, that was fantastic. Just walkthrough of the whole history of it. I really appreciate that.
Well, not the whole history.
Yeah, the important stuff. But yeah, I think a lot of times in the United States we do take for granted sometimes the luxury that we have to just trust all these entities that are in play in everyday life and in society. But on a global perspective, a lot of times they can't trust their governments or their banks or their central entities. And so while for us it might seem totally unfamiliar and strange, for others this is a total game changer. And so that ownership and being able to prove ownership decentrally and in any way is incredibly important. There's one last pillar I do want to touch on before moving into some of where we're at today. The permissionlessness that you guys have mentioned a couple times. I do want to break that down just a little bit for those who are unfamiliar with the term and are new to space. So if either of you could kind of explain a little bit about what that means and kind of like what it looks like in terms of Web3.
Permissionlessness. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I think there's a good example of that also ties into my last point, because I said ownership on a blockchain isn't always enforceable, and that's true for certain things. But I think where we've done a pretty good job, and it does work today, is in money, right? Something like Bitcoin, right? So what does sort of permissionlessness mean when it comes to ownership? Well, I think one basic definition, right, is you can use this value anywhere. You can send it anywhere. All you need is an internet connection. Right? I kind of went over that earlier. You have a wallet address. You have an internet connection. You can transact this value, right? And what gives something like Bitcoin value, same thing that gives any sort of money value, is network effect, right? It's the network of people that will take it, for goods and services, or to hold as a store of value. Now, one way, getting back to what I was saying, right, that we actually can enforce this new idea of ownership and property rights when it comes to money, is imagine that you are in a foreign country, not this one, and for whatever reason the government decides to persecute you, or persecute your group of people. And they try to take all of your property rights from you. And they try to take, and they freeze your bank accounts. And this happens to people all around the world. So you're forced to, you have two decisions. You can stay in this country that clearly doesn't want you and is taking everything from you, or you can flee, right? Now, if you flee, right, you're forfeiting, right, whatever property you have in that country, of course. You're forfeiting your physical property, and if your money is in that country's currency, you're obviously going to forfeit that. You can't access your bank accounts. But if you have a Bitcoin wallet or an Ethereum wallet, and you have cryptocurrency on that wallet, you can memorize your mnemonic phrase. You can memorize your 12-word seed phrase. And you may lose your hardware wallet, right? You may not be able to access your computer. Your computer might get confiscated, right? But you can memorize your 12-word mnemonic phrase, and you can flee the country, and you can go to some other country, any other country, and you can set up that wallet and recover your funds with that seed phrase. So that's quite powerful, right? And that's what we mean by, that's a pillar of Web3, right? That's ownership that did not exist before, right? That's a new level of ownership that's global and decentralized.
Anything you'd like to add?
No, I think permissionlessness and trustlessness are two critical pieces of Web3, and where that comes from, as Shahar said, is the ability to access and get into the system, whoever you are, in any part of the world, potentially any part of the universe over time. But the core aspect of this is the trustless aspect, and maybe I'll speak a little bit to that. And the fact is that whatever we do, it is structured in a way where it's not based on trusting you or any group of people, and in a way that makes you an intermediary, makes you somebody who I have to go through to be able to successfully interact with the system. So the trustlessness brings about the permissionlessness, because anybody can join the system regardless of them being an adversarial player or a good player, honest person, bad person, doesn't matter. They can all join the system, and they'll all be incentivized to behave in a certain way that individually could benefit them and overall results in a functioning economy and a functioning transfer of value. That is pretty immense, because that has not existed in the history of humanity. So in many ways, 5,000 years of, or maybe even longer of history in terms of transfer of value, but the past few decades have been particularly eventful because we have learned how to do global, trustless, permissionless transfer of value for the very, very first time.
Yeah, thank you guys. I think that was a perfect explanation to wrap up the pillars. I do want to jump into some of the pain points of Web 2 and kind of explore why this is necessary. Like, where are we at today? What are some of the problems with the internet and social media and all these aspects of our daily lives that are digital that could be improved or need to be improved with Web 3?
Okay. So I think a bunch of the things we've already touched on, maybe obvious examples of that. I'll give a few more examples. So Web 2, so I think one large point, right, is the opacity of incentive alignment, right? And that causes us to not really understand the business models of what we're getting into. It causes us to basically make poor trade-offs, for instance, with our data. An easy example, right, Web 2, if anyone's seen The Social Dilemma, the documentary, excellent documentary, really talks about a lot of the problems with these massive, Web 2 platforms, and a lot of the problems are in how they were built and the incentive alignment that's in place, right? And specifically, right, these giant Web 2 platforms that we all know and use, despite their flaws, right? Because they have become sort of critical. They, profiteer from our data, and they sell us as a product to advertisers, right? These platforms are built for advertisers. Advertisers are their customers, not us. And so therefore, they are built to maximize our attention, right, that they then sell to advertisers. Now imagine, imagine if we started over and we built these Web2 like Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, but instead of deciding, you know what, let's maximize mining people's attention so we can sell it to advertisers, what if we made the decision, let's maximize like personal well-being or like, you know, personal happiness, right? We have the data, you know, around these things more than we did before. We have the ability to sort of do that, right? And something that Web3 can help us with, again, is, you know, designing that system in a transparent way where we can talk about here's how the incentives are working in the system, here's what we're optimizing for, is it working? If we're not getting the outcomes we want, we can all see the incentives, we can either opt out, we can use other platforms that have a better incentive alignment we want, or we can make tweaks. So again, going back to earlier point I made, right, elevating the conversation to where we can see how, you know, these systems execute around incentives and value, just value in general, right, where value flow is going on these platforms. And then we can better make those decisions as consumers, and we can try to make some intentional decisions about having these platforms better serve us, I think, rather than, you know, some business interest or political interest that we don't have much insight into. So I think, like, to me, that's one of the biggest problems with Web 2 that I'm hopeful Web 3 can start to address.
Yeah, I think like in A16Z's State of Crypto report for 2022, they had this great graphic where all the big like social media companies that Shahar names and most tech companies in general over the last decade use the same business strategy to scale. The network effects was like the huge buzzword for VCs, and everyone's like, how can a platform acquire network effects? And it was basically this model where you try to attract as many users as possible, no matter the cost. We'll spend hundreds of millions of dollars of VC money to attract as many users as possible. And once we get to that inflection point, we can now swap to extracting out as much as we can. And so it changes from attracting users to extracting from users. And I think Web3 is all about potentially changing that business model to be a little bit more of a positive sum, maybe feedback loop, so that there isn't as much extraction of attention almost.
Yeah, it's like all of a sudden you have to make a better deal with the user, right? Because you can no longer just extract everything from the user has the ability to own some of these things, they have the ability to see what you're doing in terms of incentives and value flow. So you get a better deal, right, at the end of the day, I think.
One last question before we conclude this panel. I do want to kind of touch on some of the barriers to Web3 adoption. Obviously, the term arose about a year or so ago. It's seen some significant pushback from just mainstream media in terms of the brand and the, I guess, connotation around the term Web3. So what are some barriers that you see over maybe the short and long term to wide-scale Web3 adoption and development?
So, great question. A big part of blockchain and Web3 has been that the marketing has gone way ahead of the education, which I think events like this really, really help fix that. There's a core component of this that is transformative. It is a new way of thinking. And it's a way of thinking that, by the way, once you get into, you can't get out of. Take me as an example. I never thought I would ever think this way, and now I cannot not think this way. There's a big understanding component of it that I think over time will get critical mass, and a lot more people will understand the value of what Web3 is. Yes, some of these are buzzwords, but they're meant to be much than buzzwords. They're meant to be concepts that I believe is one barrier. There's only about something like a few 100 million people who interact with anything in Web3, and the planet has a population close to 8 billion. The next billion are going to come to Web3 when they understand what Web3 is, not as an engineering tool, not as a jargon tool, but as something that they can personally benefit from. The incentives are there for them to interact with this. Grandmothers, grandfathers, young kids, everybody has something of value here, and that has to be appreciated and will be appreciated with time. That's number one. Number two, there's been, of course, other forces, oligopolies, folks that will lose value if Web3 were to take over. So there is resistance there. That's natural. Always happens when systems are changing from one to another. I do believe that that's transient, meaning that's just temporary. With time, the resistance coming from oligopolies and governments will go down.
Yeah, I think those are both great points. Yeah, and I guess I don't know if I even have more. I think those are right on. I'll expand maybe a bit more on what I see as probably the biggest one, which is the second point that you mentioned, the incumbency, right? So I'll just share this one sort of funny story. So when cars first came out, some of you might know this, some of you might not. When cars first came out, the horse carriage lobby was up in arms, right? They were losing it, and they managed to convince. They were a very strong incumbent. They managed to convince Congress to pass a law, and Congress did pass this law that said, if you were going to drive an automobile, you had to hire someone to walk 10 feet in front of your car and wave a red flag to warn people of the danger, right, of you driving that car. And this like did happen. It existed, right? So there's a long history, and so maybe this will become sort of optimistic note, right? Because of no one uses horse carriages anymore, and we all use cars. So there, this country like has a long history of getting things right eventually, but first getting them wrong, and so the same thing I think is happening today. The incumbents that stand the most to lose. Which is a lot of people, and it will be a lot more people, because go back to what I said about value mediation, right? We're disrupting all value mediation, right? Every incumbent that has, that is extracting value from value mediation as a concept, right, stands to be disrupted. They stand to lose something. And so they are heavily incented, right, to slow this down, to stop it, to gain control of it, and they feed into all of the narratives that they think will best allow them to do that, which are, this is used for bad actors only, this is like highly dangerous, it burns the planet, which we can debunk, all of these, right? But they help drive those narratives, they help drive, legislation that slows us down, and I think this is the biggest barrier. I think education will come, and everyone here that is already educated or that's getting more educated, you tell your friends, right? Have talks with your family, think about these concepts, right? Decide for yourself. But we can start kind of increasing the mind share, right? I think all of that is happening and will continue to happen. But the big thing we have to kind of worry about and make sure we get right is that we don't pass any terrible regulations that I think it's kind of inevitable to stop it, but slowing it down is significant, right? And it means other countries or other less good, less altruistic versions of this tech will have more of a chance to flourish, and we don't want that. We want to move full speed ahead. We know there's a lot of things we can fix, and I'll leave it at that. Let's all try and do that.
Yeah, I think it's a good way to end it on a good note. The U.S. makes mistakes in the short term, but in the long term, we always get it right. Hopefully, we'll get it right in the short term this time. But thank you both for your wonderful insight in this discussion. It's been a pleasure, so thank you.